There's no need to manipulate the experience right now, just becoming aware of the way the breath moves in through the nose, noticing if it's deep, maybe it's shallow. Becoming aware of the exhalation. And see if it's possible to make your exhalation as long as the inhalation. So as you take a deep breath in and allow your diaphragm to expand, be aware of how you approach your exhalation. Making the intention of having a long, present exhalation. And allow yourself to do this several times, taking a deep breath in and allowing the inhalation to move through your diaphragm, expanding the belly. And when you exhale, relaxing, releasing, letting go. And see if it's possible to find the space in between the exhalation and the inhalation. There's the space where no breath happens. It's called the kumbhaka. And you will note that the more that you can stay, abide in those spaces without breath, the more your mind also becomes quiet. So as to say that the space in between the breaths grow and the space in between the thoughts grows. And the more intimate you become with your breath, the more you can tune into the parasympathetic nervous system, state of relaxation, of receptivity, of openness. And we're going to do a short pranayama called samavriti, which means equal breath. It's really simple, and you can simply listen to my voice and see how it digests for you. So we're going to exhale fully and allow ourselves to be without breath. And inhale through the nose softly, counting 1, 2, 3, 4. We're going to hold that breath in for 3, 4. Exhale softly for 1, 2, 3, 4. And staying without breath in the kumbhaka for 1, 2, 3, 4. Inhale through your nose. Hold that breath in. Exhale softly. And try to remain without breath. Inhale through your nose, counting 4. Holding that breath in. Exhaling softly, gently. And finding that space without breath. And see if you can do a few rounds of this samavriti on your own, allowing the mind to engage with the exercise. It's useful if you can count. The most important thing is that you are connected with the exercise, connecting with your breath, connecting with the exhalation. And on your next exhale, you can allow yourself to stay with that breath. Perhaps there's a sense of more spaciousness, a lightness of being, a deep connection internally with this sense of presence that cannot really be pinpointed to where it is, but you feel it. You're more connected. You're centered. Naturally returning to a rhythm of breath that feels comfortable for you. Remaining connected to yourself, your true self, through the breath. And when you're ready, you can open your eyes and we can continue working on this framework from this point internally, from this connection. I'm going to read from the Song of the Avadut, one of my favorite books of Advaita Vedanta, speaking about the mind. O mind, why are you so deluded? Why do you run about like a frightened ghost? Become aware of the indivisible self. Be rid of attachment. Be happy and free. This is from chapter 1, verse 18. So constantly our mind is running about, fragmenting into different ideas, into different notions, even desires. And we're naturally split from our ego consciousness. Part of us wants this and the other part wants that. And there's a constant ongoing conflict between our inner selves, fragmentation. And so through this approach of connecting with our innermost self, we realize that although there can be all of these fragments going on, there's a deeper consciousness containing it all, our real self. And so where do we begin when we want to refer to our self? Because Western materialism teaches us that we are these bodies, that everything is matter. What we not see does not exist. But when we look at Eastern traditions, we recognize that there's a different approach that's a little bit more, that goes deeper. And they call it the Atman. And so even though the storylines can be the same, meaning it's not that if you go to the Eastern world, you'll begin to see invisible things. You might, but you can also see it in the Western world. I guess what I'm trying to say is that it's important to understand where these theories of reality begin. And so when we take a look at what Eastern traditions say, we become a little bit expanded. It's not only that we are these bodies. Another quote from the Song of the Avadut. The one God who shines within everything, who is formless like the cloudless sky, is the pure, stainless self of all. Without any doubt, that is who I am. So the Song of the Avadut is talking about the deepest, innermost nature of our being. So many times we identify with our thoughts and we may think that that's who we are. Anything that the mind thinks becomes an identity. But through meditation, we anchor deeper. And so what Eastern traditions say, and especially Advaita Vedanta, it talks about the Atman. The Atman is a real self. And it is it is referred to each one of us as a point of light in the mind of God. And that point of light is called the Gyoti Bindu. And inherently through this framework, we recognize that we are part of the intelligence and the creativity and the unconditional love of creation. And again, we're not talking about a God in the sky that creates all of this as if we are dollhouses in a world, but we're talking about pure intelligence, and that we, because we are made, as quantum physics proves, of these emptiness, we are part of that. And so that begins to expand our notion. And so what happens is that if we take a look at ourselves from this framework, we begin to see that we're coming from pure awareness. We're coming from this undescribable state of mind that many people who have had spontaneous remissions or near-death experiences, or even anxiety or panic attacks can relate to this expanded state of awareness in which the material plane dissolves. And we're coming from this framework of complete expansion into the wombs of our mothers. And that's a little bit constricting if you actually think about it. It's really interesting. When I talk about this workshop, I'm taken to that place and time in which we are incarnated. And so even though we're putting it in language, it's a really delicate thing we're talking about. Pure consciousness incarnates in the womb of a mother because of different karmic reasons. There is always a mission, a learning, a growth process of why we come into this world. And we incarnate in the womb of our mother, coming from the state of pure awareness, ready to go on our mission in life, our purpose in life. And the womb of our mothers is meant to be a resting space. So if you think about a day that was full for you, a day in which you were able to accomplish every single goal you had set yourself to do, but you were also betrayed and you were also made feel the worst, humiliated, the worst things in your life. Everything happened on this day. Most likely all that you want to do is go into a room that is clean, neat, organized, quiet, and rest and integrate. And the same is with consciousness. We're coming from this expanded state of awareness. Some doctrines say that we come from different lives, but what we know is that we're coming from a mystery that is expanded, that is beyond words, and we incarnate into the womb of the mother. And not all the times, especially in this day and age, the womb is a neutral space. And this is not meant to pry on any one of our mothers. We have all been incarnated through the womb of a mother, and they have all done the best that they could. So I don't want this to be taken as like we're blaming someone. It's just to expand awareness and understand where we're coming from and what has been going on. And so it's not necessarily a restful space or a clean space because, first of all, physically, mothers have habits that are not the healthiest, whether it be their eating patterns, whether it be their addiction to substances, pills, also all the doctors prying in and seeing if the baby is okay. And also psychologically and energetically, it's not always a neutral space. Even if we are more than welcomed in our family, there's always a sense of doubt within the consciousness of the mother, as we all experience doubt and fear and uncertainty. And so naturally, consciousness begins to tap into the energetics of what it is to feel trapped, what it is to feel unwelcomed, what it is to feel fear for the first time through energetics. And this begins to create an identity through these energies that are coming in. This I mentioned earlier, that everything that the mind thinks will create an identity. So what would my life be without this belief? My thoughts are not who I am. This slide was meant to go earlier, but it is the same thread of thought. This moment in which consciousness incarnates in the womb of a mother and begins to tap into all of these new energetics, it's not expanded anymore, is now beginning to learn to form, not only forming within a body, but also forming its own thoughts, identities, its own energetics. This is what is the ego formation. So the ego there's many different frameworks to understand the ego. How we're going to see it right now is a psychological term that refers to this universal structure of how we relate to and with the world. So when we are born, and we're born into this world, we've gone through the incarnation process in the womb of our mother, we are born into the world, and again, everything is kind of overwhelming. There's new sounds, new smells, perhaps a lot of overwhelming forces coming at consciousness that is difficult for us to perceive. And so the ego is what we create in order to relate in this world. Does that make sense? It's like we're coming from this expanded state of awareness in which there are no limits, everything is a mystery, and we are born into this world, and there's suddenly structures that are not necessarily the purest, there's energetics, there's a lot of different things happening, and they become overwhelming. And so consciousness needs to form some sort of identity in order to deal with that. Does that make sense? Okay. So this is where the psychoanalytic insights become really useful. Melanie Klein's work, she was the second psychoanalytic developer after Anna Freud, and she worked a lot with children. And what she realized is that when consciousness is overwhelmed by these forces, it needs to find a way to protect itself. It needs to create a stimulus barrier. So as consciousness is identifying with this form, because let's say when a baby is born into the world, it doesn't know how to feed itself, it doesn't know how to clean itself, everything is overwhelming, it tries to speak, nobody understands. And so it needs to learn how to trade in things, right? It needs to learn how to speak to ask for what it wants. And it realizes that there's this feedback loop. If I smile, mommy smiles. If mommy smiles, I get my milk. Okay, so I begin to learn how to do this. If I laugh, the other laughs, and then I'm adorable, and then people want to carry me. It learns that it is living through this feedback loop. But as it does so, and it begins to create identities, it begins to repress the real self. And this repression is the pivotal choice of the rest of our lives. When we forget the truth of who we are, when we forget that we are coming from this mystery. And this begins to create a sense of lack, that what Jacques Lacan called le manque. And so all of our lives become an attempt to fill this lack, because we've forgotten that we are the real self. It's like, I always use this example of when you're trying to make a puzzle or create a puzzle, and there's this one piece that you're missing, and you try to place a lot of different pieces to cover up that hole. But the only piece that will fill up that hole is the Atman, in this case, using that metaphor. And so all of our lives, we're trying to fill up that void with shopping, with relationships, with addiction to social media, with different substances, with different activities, constantly trying to fill up that void through different means and strategies, when really it is presence that will come to not only fill that void, but it will be revealed that that void is actually pure fullness, pure potential. So what Melanie Klein discovered was that as we repress who we are and we're trying to deal with the world, we have to create a stimulus barrier. Pure consciousness is extremely sensitive. Again, like I was saying, there's new smells, there's new voices, there's new stimulus coming at us, and it can be quite overwhelming. Things break, people get angry, people shout, there's cars, there's sounds, it becomes overwhelming. And so the stimulus barrier acts like a semi-permeable membrane. If you remember in biology, there is this, a semi-permeable membrane allows certain things to go in and certain things are not allowed to go in. That is how the mind begins to operate. And when we create the stimulus barrier, consciousness says, okay, so Prema can process this thought, is okay, we'll allow this thought to come into consciousness. Or this thought is too overwhelming, she can't deal with that, let's push that away. when it does that, it's splitting our mind. It's not pure awareness anymore. It is creating this, what is called in Advaita Satarivu, or split mind. So in Hindu, I'm sorry, split mind, Sanskrit, split mind. And so we are splitting what we can know versus what we can't know, the conscious mind and the unconscious mind. And when the unconscious mind is created in a way, like when the mind is allowed to know certain things and not know certain things, we are repressing not only the unconscious that is related in psychoanalysis as the impulses and the dark forces and the repressed desires, all of this, not only that, but we're also repressing the true nature of who we are, the beauty, the kindness, the joy, the spark of joy that we have. And the reason why psychoanalysis is so important, as I was mentioning in the beginning, and we're going to go a little bit into the history, again, not as a theoretical necessarily, but more to tap into our own selves. When Freud discovered that we were repressing things, what he saw was that repression began to manifest in the body in symptoms. So a lot of people, mostly women, were manifesting these symptoms of unease in their bodies. And what he realized is that when he allowed them to speak, he was a psychiatrist before he worked with chemical reactions, and then he realized the power of love and speech and sublimation. And when he allowed these women to speak, he saw that things were being released. Things that before he would have just prescribed the medication were now being raised into consciousness, brought into the heart, and women were free again, also men. And so what he discovered was that the unconscious is always operating as a code that we have to learn how to decode. Once we can decode our codes, our symptoms of suffering disappear, or our illnesses disappear. That's what he thought. So as he developed his work on the unconscious, he realized that these traumatic memories from childhood get frozen in time, and we carry them on as we grow older. So things that may have been traumatic when we are 4, 5, 6 years old, seen from an adult framework, are not that traumatic, but they were when we were little. Does that make sense? Things that were overwhelming when we were little continue to be somehow overwhelming as we grow older, because the unconscious is still trapped in time. And so those repressed memories that we hold from childhood create a pattern of how we relate later when we are adults. And it takes a while to meet this with compassion. Like when many of you will come up with your own examples, but the one example that I have really vividly is I was quite young playing with my mother. We were playing like Barbies or dolls or something. The phone rings and she gets up to pick up the phone, and I feel completely abandoned. And this created like this whole pattern of abandonment and a hole within my being that it took some time. Every time a phone rang, I felt some sort of anxiety in my body until I could actually trace back into those patterns and realize that no, I wasn't abandoned. And even if I was still okay. I was safe. I was, these sort of things that for some may be quite light and for others is going to be quite heavy. But the thing is that these little things begin to form the way that we later relate to the world. And so the magic of the interpretation that Freud and then different psychoanalytic developers continued is that when something feels traumatic, it's something that we can't speak of, something that feels completely prohibited for us to go into. And the magic of interpretation is when, from wisdom, we can take that feels traumatic and give it meaning, give it an interpretation via compassion. So not as a victimization of a poor me, this happened to me, but more of an invitation to take responsibility of how we developed that trauma and how we can be free of it. Because so far as until we do that, we're living on this autopilot, as we were saying, on this zombie mode, being afraid of things that maybe are not that strong, we're not as powerful, or we live in self-doubt without allowing ourselves to shine and to fully express the totality of our being. And so interpretation is what allows us to move from this victimization into sovereignty, into our power. And what Advaita Vedanta teaches us is that we can disidentify from that trauma. It is not the disidentification of a new age that says, because many of us have possibly heard this, like, you're not your body, therefore you are free. And so it happens a lot in like new age parties, tantric groups, in which there's also a lot of pain. So this identification process that Advaita Vedanta allows us to do is to recognize that all of this has been a product of consciousness going through this experience, but it's untouched by it. There's this beautiful metaphor that Ramana Maharshi used to use with his students, a sage from India. He used to say that life is like an image that is being projected onto a screen. If there is fire burning on the screen, do people from the movie theater get up with jugs of water and throw it on the screen to take off the fire? No, I don't think so. So if we can see that all of this is being projected onto the screen of consciousness, then disidentification is possible. We can see it more like a dream. And here's another like gist or switch. The world is illusion, as in the Upanishads it said, or the world is a dream, and yet why not dream the most beautiful dream possible? If the world is illusion and consciousness is just a delusion of the mind, why not live the most beautiful life possible? Why not open our hearts? Why not recognize the truth of who we are? And so here is where the path of yoga becomes so useful. We have these three assemblage points in consciousness, and I'll do another module on the Kundalini map in a psychological way. But Viveka, Vijnana, and Vairagya are these assemblage points that we have. Viveka is discernment, the capacity to have that recognition and clear seeing to pierce through the self-sabotage of the ego. Vijnana is wisdom, to use this wisdom that, the Vijnana is the wisdom body, to be able to see with wise understanding what is going on. And Vairagya is the detachment, to say, okay, all of this is happening. Can I just contain rather than be entangled in it and grow? And so why are we looking at this? All scriptures say that the ego is the root of suffering, and it is the reason why we suffer. And so the work that we're doing is looking at that. We're not holding hands and singing Kumbaya, although I have a lot of desire to do that, especially now that we're all in isolation. But the point is, the truth of this work is to take a clear look at our inner selves and do the work of unveiling these layers so that we can have more access to the truth of our being, because that's what we are. We are love, we are goodness, we're the wisdom incarnated, bringing all of these goodness into the world. And so the spiritual journey is described as a threefold movement, constantly unfolding. There is an awakening when we recognize, we can open our eyes and realize that we have been living in a zombie mode or in autopilot. And we bring the illumination, the light of wisdom, in order to deal with that. And the more that we can deal with that, the more we can access the liberation of consciousness, the disidentification as an ego self, and live from the purity of our true self. And so we are diving now into the actual structuring layers of our being. That was more like an introduction. And the structuring layers of our being are the energies that structure our perception of reality. I love this painting by Hilma Klint. It shows these like concentric circles. And if you see, there's this silver path that goes right onto the center. So if you keep this, I wish I had a whiteboard. Maybe I'll get funding to get one. But if you keep this image in mind, you'll see that we're always trying to move deeper into the core of who we are, and the rest are just layers. Awakening, illumination, and liberation, Ali is asking. So the first structuring layer of our being is the sensor. The sensor is what I was speaking before as the stimulus barrier. The sensor is this, I don't like this metaphor so much, but it comes in handy. It's like this bouncer at a party that decides who can enter the party and who can't enter the party. The sensor is a structuring layer because it's always keeping the mind in homeostasis. As I was explaining before in the module, the sensor gets created when we're quite little and energies are really overwhelming. But as we grow older, the sensor doesn't grow old with us. And so things that were continually overwhelming continue to be overwhelming when we're growing up. And that's the beginning of self-sabotage. The sensor also keeps the conscious mind slave to the unconscious mind. I don't know if you've seen this image, it's used a lot in psychoanalytic explanations of an iceberg. And when you look at an iceberg and you see the tip above the water, and you don't recognize that there's this humongous piece of ice underneath the water that many can't see from above the surface. It's the same with our minds. Above the water, above the sensor, we have our conscious mind, with all our beliefs of who we are as a limited individual with our identities. Underneath the surface, there's this humongous block that is our unconscious. And again, our unconscious is not necessarily the darkness and the evil that psychoanalysis often refers to, but there's also all the beauty, all the goodness, or all the light that we chose to repress. And so by having a sensor, we're keeping our conscious mind driven by the unconscious. Again, why? Because the conscious mind is quite small and powerless compared to the unconscious mind. Does that make sense? Hello? Can you hear me?
Okay. Yes, we can hear you. It makes sense.
I will update the Wi-Fi. So we are each our greatest inhibitors. And the more that we can allow ourselves to break through the sensor, through open space through the sensor, and we'll get to how to do that later in the module, but the sensor is that which keeps us small as a protective mechanism when we were little, and that does not serve us so much when we are in adulthood. And it's inhibiting the greatness and the amazing things that could happen out of fear, out of protection, because something was overwhelming when we were little. And I think it's worth mentioning that this was created out of a desire to protect in consciousness. So it's not necessarily this evil thing. It later becomes like an obstacle, but it's not necessarily evil. And I think that's the function of love also, to understand that we created this to protect ourselves from things that were overwhelming. And if we're coming from wisdom and from love and from a desire to grow, we can say, you know what, I can actually deal with this now, and allow ourselves to go deeper. When we begin to depotentiate the sensor, to take power away from the sensor and give it back to our real self, we're ending that self-sabotage, that fear of being present to what is at the moment. And we begin to live with grace and with more compassion for ourselves and for the other. And through that, living with more clarity, with more focus, and with more directed willpower. Because again, if we're trying to keep all of this information below the surface, that's a lot of effort for the mind. And therefore, we're not having enough power to direct our focus and our will to where we want it to. So the more clarity and freedom, the more capacity we have to direct ourselves. Below the sensor, let's say if we're talking about concentric circles, we have the intrauterine subconscious. And the intrauterine subconscious is pre-verbal, meaning it's not structured in language. It's more energetics and projections, is more metaphysical energy dimension. And in the intrauterine subconscious, we have those fantasies that took form in the womb of our mother, and then they remain in our awareness. So this is everything that has to do with energetics. Again, as we were talking about, when we are, if you've had children yourself, I'm not a mother, but I've delved into this work, and in my own inner work of being a child of a mother, sensing the amount of confusion, the amount of feelings that are happening when you're bringing a child into the world, and how this creates energetics in the womb, right? This begins to create fantasies, either fantasies of superiority, that I'm going to be this amazing queen when I'm born into the world, and I'm going to bring all of my goodness, and I'm going to be the best golden child, or fantasies of, maybe my mom is confused, maybe my mom doesn't want me, maybe it's going to be really difficult, maybe I'm not going to shine. Both the superiority complex and the inferiority complex in our consciousness are a lie, because we are pure consciousness coming into the world. And the only reason we would be a golden child is because we recognize ourselves as a golden child of God, not necessarily of the structure. And so the intrauterine subconscious is any desire that we have to get back into the womb and disappear, and to create a sense of being back in the womb of the mother. And later on, before we go into our break, there's different questions and prompts that will allow you to reflect on how this works for you. There's many decisions that we make in our lives in adulthood that are based on this level of our being. The moment where our mom was filled with joy that we were coming into the world, we usually make decisions based on that. In fact, there's an example that is quite subtle but really interesting. I have a friend who we worked together in the ashram with these structures, and she was about to build her house, and she had a really limited budget, and she wanted to allocate a huge amount of this budget to an external patio, which didn't make a lot of sense. And as we delved into this, what she discovered was that the moment that her mother's fountain broke, she was on her mom's millionaire's friend's outdoor patio. And now she had this, when she was building her own home, she had this huge fantasy of building an outdoor patio with all of these amazing qualities as they were when her fountain broke. Does that make sense? There was this desire to recreate that moment of a new intrauterine subconscious, that it's okay if she builds the patio or not. We can take decisions as we like, but to become aware of where are they coming from and have that clear understanding so that we're really enacting from where we want to enact. The third one, I feel it's easier to relate from a conscious perspective. It's the personal subconscious. And this layer is completely unique and personal for each one of us, depending on our upbringing and our relationality. Not one subconscious is going to be the same. If you have siblings, you will realize that a lot of your personal subconscious, although there may be traits of similarity, the unconscious are completely different one from the other. The last workshop we did, my brother was present, and he was just like bombarding the chat like, oh yes, you're so right, because our subconscious are so different, even though we were born in the same conditions. And so even if you were born with siblings and you received the same amount of milk measured with a cup, the same pancake measured exactly the same place, exactly the same, you were given the same clothes, the unconscious are going to be completely different. And that is because of the projections that we are receiving and the way that we identify with it. So let me expand a little bit more. To me, this is one of the most fascinating things of inner work. We receive a projection. That means that some sort of command or perception is thrown at us. And we can choose how we identify with that. So if I receive a command, I have the power, because I am pure will, to either reject that projection and live its opposite, or identify and serve that projection. Does that make sense? So this one is the personal subconscious is built upon nucleus. So the first one is our nuclear family system. whether that was our mother and our father and our siblings, or a grandmother and a grandfather, whatever that nuclear system was, we received our most immediate commands and projections. She's going to be an amazing ballerina. Or I always wanted to have a daughter so that she would love me and she would be so sweet. Or I wanted to have a very intelligent son that would become a mechatronic engineer. Or like whatever the command was, consciousness has choice. It can say, okay, mommy, I'm going to do this for you. I'm going to be your good girl. Or no, I'm going to be a punk star. We have the choice, you know, we can decide how we want to identify with it. I think what's so sad about this was when I realized that there wasn't like a choice other than that. Like it's either yes or no. And it's when we begin our spiritual journey that we realize that there's another choice. But from the ego is either acceptance or rejection. And then an extended family system, it can be cousins and neighbors, any other sort of paradigm that operates differently from our nuclear family system. The kindergarten system, this is really important, like when we begin to receive commands from our teachers and that begins to form an identity, like she's so intelligent, okay, then I have to perform this way in a test, or he's not good for math, then he's going to fail math, or these kinds of things that begin to form identities that are not even necessarily true. And the social system. It's really interesting. I have a lot of like really curious memories of when I first began to go into my classmates' houses, and they lived completely different lives than my family. And that begins to create some sort of exploratory formation. So again, I'll provide with questions at the end so that you can reflect on your own. I just want to recheck how my hearing, can you hear me well? Okay, awesome. The next layer is the collective subconscious. And the collective subconscious is based on the culture, the class, and the epoch that we are born. So it's basically the mainstream underlying current that society is bringing to our awareness. And nowadays, the media has dominance over these ideals and master signifiers. Master signifier is a psychoanalytic and an etymological and a semiotic concept that refers to that one underlying thing that we can't stop thinking about collectively. Nowadays is money. And I think with the pandemic, a few others have been sprouting that are more based on goodness. But these are the fantasies that dictate which are the mandates that we have as citizens, as workers, as members of a collective, the gender roles that we have, what success is. And so it's not that we're trying to build an anarchic thing, completely the opposite. I'm trying to, at least from my work, bring more order and structure, but from a pure source of sense, so that we become aware of which are the systems that we are serving, and finding really what our true role is. And this is where we get into the archetypal subconscious. This is a really fascinating subject. I wish we had more time to delve into it, and I'm leaving you some resources so that you can do your own research if you feel inspired by this information. So the archetypal subconscious, or the archetypal structure, is that pattern, that imprint that each of us has in our journey. The archetypes are these primordial stories that sprout from consciousness. It can be expressed through myth, through legends, through cinema, through art. It's beautiful. We are channels for this divine energy to come through, and we all have different archetypal patterns stored in our subconscious. Some of them we act consciously, some of them we act on unconsciously. And as we delve deeper into our being, what we want to do is really access that archetypal subconscious and live from it. As society grew more into a capitalistic, materialistic structure, and again, I'm not against capitalism, I'm just saying that things get corrupted through time as consciousness falls. And so, although many of us are born, all of us are born with our archetypal imprint, it gets distorted. So for instance, if you are born with the archetype of a healer and you study medicine, and you go to medical school and you're taught something that is not necessarily healing, but rather more like a band-aid. And so the next thing you know, you're working behind a counter prescribing pharmaceuticals to an industry that, for the profit of an industry. And that is kind of distorted from the real archetype of a healer. Does that make sense? So what we are doing when we are accessing these depths of our being is uprooting these archetypal patterns, facing fear and going beyond it. When we are uprooting, we are faced with the uncertainty of security. The archetypal patterns require the courage for us to expand beyond our comfort zones and to turn that love for what we love, that love for everything that we desire, to turn into service to the world. And the question is, what are you fighting ultimately, or what are you afraid of ultimately? And you will realize that as you do inner work, most likely the answer is that you're afraid of your own power. So the archetypal patterns are usually emerging as a call to adventure, as a call to step up from where we are living at. And this is an invitation to restructure our personal and our collective values. As I was using the example of medical school, it's the same with any sort of role that we play in life, whether it be philosophy. Like I was so depressed when I went to philosophy school because I felt I was so disconnected from the true essence of what philosophy is. Or music, or healing, as I was saying, or architecture. Like sometimes, like if you look at architecture in the ancient world, there's a huge difference from architecture nowadays when we're building all these private things, right? Like we've lost connection with the sense of service and community and devotion. Same with poetry, same with mathematics. It's like things have been so distorted. And yet, if we do this inner work and we have the courage to dive deeper, we realize that this role that we have is divine. And as we listen attentively to the yearnings of our heart, to the deepest desires of our soul, we can present ourselves anew to the world and bring in that power to restructure society. So here are a few resources for you to dive deeper into the archetypal patterns. I saw somebody commented that the next workshop should be on archetypal patterns. I wish I could speak a lot about this, but really a lot of it is from the work of Carl Jung and Joseph Campbell. And maybe we could do a book group on it. That would be nice. So these are some resources. The Mythos series by Joseph Campbell, you can purchase it on Amazon. Then there's a free documentary on YouTube called Finding Joe. It's quite recent. I don't know if you've watched it, but it explains really visually this call to action. There's a book by Carl Jung called Man and His Symbols. And then the Dreams, Images, and Reflections book by Carl Jung also speaks about this. Again, I'm going to send all the resources, so not to worry to write notes. So what Joseph Campbell used to say, and I really love this, when he went to India and he was exploring God, there is this mantra, Sat, Chit, Ananda. Sat is truth, Chit is intelligence, Ananda is bliss. And so he questioned himself and he was like, okay, I cannot know truth, like truth with a capital T. What is truth? Many of us have different approaches and it's really difficult to know what is truly real. And then Chit, for the mind to try to grapple with the pure intelligence of the absolute is going to be quite difficult. It actually makes shit of its purity as shit. Like we totally ruin things when we try to understand them. But he said, Ananda as bliss, I can know that. Like I can know what bliss feels like for me. And it's not a hedonistic, and also the Finding Joe documentary gets into, it's not a hedonistic, like what gives me pleasure, but more like what makes me feel on fire, what brings joy into my heart, what makes me want to connect with the world and serve. So let's say you didn't have to think about money as a burden, and I keep emphasizing this, like some people want to join the workshop and they don't have money, and I'm like, join, but they don't want to. But so if you didn't have money, how would you like to live and spend your time? How would you be? And so to follow your bliss is this connection with finding out what we love, finding out what we love to do, and go back and find it. Always going inward to taste, what is that bliss? And Ramana Maharshi, in one of his satsangs, people were coming and asking questions to the satsang, and he started replying like, go back the way you came from and find it. And it was like kind of discouraging for a lot of people because they were traveling all the way to India to ask this sage a question. He was like, go back to where you came from and find it. But that is the point, that if we trace back into the purity of ourselves, we'll find those answers. I don't mean to discourage you from asking questions at the end, though. Please do bring your questions. And if I have the answer, or if any of you have the answer, we'll discuss them. So when we're diving into the archetypes, I think what is so beautiful is that we can begin to restructure our circles of compassion, our society. And again, as I was saying, like, how do we return to the purity of them? I don't want to repeat myself, but I think that the example of the doctor is so clear, and you can find in your own lives, like, which have been the path that you've been called to follow, and that somehow you feel that they're out of alignment, but not because you don't love what you do, but because society has somehow made it a degraded form. And how can you reconnect with the purity of that? And the more of us that are reconnecting to the purity of the source of what we do, the more we can live in a new world. The sixth structuring layer are the sanskaras. The sanskaras are the tendencies that we bring from prior life's experiences, and if we want to talk about past lives, also from lifetimes ago. So sanskaras are really subtle to understand. Like the other day, somebody asked a question in the workshop, like, so for example, if I'm in love with someone and I'm about to die in the deathbed and I tell them that I'm going to be with them in the next lifetime, does that mean that that creates a sanskara and then I'm reborn somehow next to that person? Like it's a really subtle thread, but it's also like the archetypal nature. Find out what are those tendencies that you find so much difficulty with. What are those desires that you can't extinguish? And what Carl Jung did with his work in transpersonal psychology was encourage people to extinguish those desires with wisdom and with clarity, and to find freedom. And it's really interesting when we think about sublimation, when we think about extinguishing desires, and the art of sublimation. What Advaita Vedanta is teaching us is, let me say this in other words. When we're talking about extinguishing our desires and living out those dreams, we're being invited to sublimate it and to live it from the highest level. So in other words, many times we get confused by the notion that we should enact every desire that, or every impulse that arises, but therefore we're not living connected to our sacredness. And again, this is what the New Age movement says, like, okay, then if we're all one, then why not do it? You know, whatever that do it is, an extreme activity, crazy sex, doing drugs, just not living connected to our centeredness. So we all have all of these desires, and the art of sublimation is bringing them with wisdom to the highest expression of what that can be. And the seventh structuring layer is our Atman. Again, returning back from where we came from, our real self. And the Atman is a structure that is always present and all-pervading, and is underlying and influencing our experience, whether we know it or not, whether we know the concept of Atman or not. Everybody is this light. And we access the Atman through divine grace, because we can always be hit by a bolt of lightning, to use a Christian expression, but also through the process of self-exploration and purification. I know we're running a little bit behind on time, but we'll be done in just a minute to close the workshop, closing the framework. So this self-exploration, as the yamas and niyamas invite us to do, is swadhyaya. Swadhyaya is self-study. And so having the notion and having the recognition that God always comes through. It doesn't matter the conditions, the situations, but it's also our efforting to get to God that makes a huge difference. So of course we can be struck by a lightning, but we also are invited to open ourselves for that energy to come through. Does that make sense? As we dive deeper into self-study, we're allowing that clarity and that creativity and that pure potential to be activated. And the inner work is a path of purification. A purification because we get to know ourselves, and knowledge is power. And we learn to understand what are our desires, and we learn to sublimate them through wisdom so that we can live in the highest expression of our being. Going to read another quote from Song of the Avadu, chapter 1, is verse 5. What then is the heart of the highest truth, the core of knowledge, the wisdom supreme? It is, I am the self, the formless one. By my very nature, I am pervading all. So this is the truth that is being spoken from this ancient scripture and brought to you via Zoom this morning. So in order to get to this core, we're invited to translate our course. Our codes, as I was explaining, our core, translate our core and our codes. It's funny, I'll explain why it's funny soon. So through meditation and contemplation, we can understand the logic of these fantasies. We're being invited to take a look inside and see how we can bring this information and translate them, interpret them, so that we can live from the highest self and not necessarily from those structures that are bounding our ego. Okay, so we have, going to skip because these are here. We have the two of dream interpretation, when we learn to observe and interpret and unlock our unique symbols. So if you have a dream journaling practice, that's excellent. And if you've never explored your dreams, I invite you to have a dream journal, and you can begin to write down your dreams. Maybe you'll remember the whole trajectory, the whole story, or maybe you'll remember just one piece of it. Whatever the thread is, write it down, reflect on it, allow it to permeate. Don't rush to make an interpretation. Just observe. What are the symbols that are arising? Why are they arising? What is happening in your life right now? What is it pointed to? What is it telling you about the future? What is it telling you about your past? Many times dreams are showing what we can't see or what we're not willing to see, and it expresses us through symbols. And each of our symbols is completely unique. So although we could reference a theory book of what a symbol is, it's really our own to make a meaning out of it. And so we keep a dream record, and eventually we'll begin to see that there's a lot of common threads between our dreams. Also, meditation is a wonderful tool to overcome the censor, because many times when we sit to meditate, and as many of you said from your sharing, thoughts arise, it is difficult to focus, sometimes even traumatic memories may arise. And so the more that we learn to sit with ourselves and contain ourselves and tap into our hearts, the more we can find that jewel inside the lotus. It's beautiful how Thich Nhat Hanh says, no mud, no lotus. So how do we allow ourselves to be in the negredo of our being and find that jewel inside? Also, karmic events are a great tool to unlock the censor. Karmic events are events that deliberately force you to awaken. Your car goes into a ditch and you have to think, well, why am I ditching myself this way? Or you have a car crash, something literally makes you stop. Or you break something that you loved, you lose something that you actually liked. Karmic events are moments in which consciousness is saying, wake up, pause and reflect on what is really going on and choose. Do you want to keep on rushing, or do you want to live from presence? So the purification process arises when we begin to look at our own lives. Again, the ego is the root of suffering. Can we see this? And spirituality, not only having access to these higher states of consciousness momentarily, but learning to cultivate that presence at each moment, sustaining that peace, that ripeness, that love. So our suffering is a call to investigate what is truly going on, to pause, to reflect, to go inward. And so I want to take this opportunity, maybe if we take the next 3 minutes, I'll email you the slides so you can take a look at all these questions and you can reflect on through our little break before we meet at 5. If you can pause right now and take the next few minutes to investigate something in the last hours before coming into the workshop that felt like an invitation to go inward. Maybe in the last day or the last week that just happened. And seeing if it's possible to look at that from the perspective of pure awareness, with love, with compassion, with containment, as a message, investigating it from the lens of compassion. And so what we will do is I'll read these questions and you'll have them in your inbox, and then we can say goodbye and meet each other at 5. Can I see how these layers structure my being? Can I see how my sensor operates? What does self-sabotage mean to me? Am I able to identify recent events from today or the week or the last month in which I have rejected growth due to unconscious forces? What am I deeply afraid of? How do I avoid my own truths? What cover-ups do I use to remain in homeostasis, again, from the ego perspective? What am I able to note when I disconnect from my center? How do I feel when I am disconnected from my own self? How do I feel when I'm connected with my innermost self? Can I see my personal fantasies and how they have shaped my decisions? Can I see what are the collective beliefs I have used to navigate reality? Can I see how fantasies limit my potential and my ability to access the magic of the present moment? Meaning if we're constantly living on a fantasy, we won't be open to what is actually arising. How can I find more connection in my life? And am I in touch with my archetypal patterns? And we'll close with this quote from the Song of the Avadut. I'm one, I'm all of this, yet I am undifferentiated beyond all forms. How then do I regard the self as both the unmanifest and the manifest world? And that's the paradox. Seeing all of these different forms and structures and layers that seem to somehow bound us, the reason why we're looking at it is to open up and realize that we're actually none of it. But if we identify with it, then it's useful to know it so that we can grow. So you can unmute yourself now, and I think we will leave all questions for later, but if you want to say goodbye and share anything before we adjourn.
Thank you so much. I'm so proud of you. It was amazing. I can't believe you're so young and you have integrated all this knowledge within you. These are not just concepts, you live by them, and that's a gift. Thank you so much for sharing.
You're so welcome, Gabi. I'm so glad you're able to join. Okay, well, I'll see you all at 5 then. If you have any questions, it's good. Just don't rush to your next activity. If you can take some time to integrate this, I will email you right away the slides. So if you want to journal on what came up, that would be amazing. And then we'll meet at 5. Okay?
Thank you, Prema.
Thank you, Prema. Thanks for
Thank you,
the
Freya.
knowledge and the wisdom you share.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Enjoy your day, everyone.
Thank you, Prema. See you soon.